The Economist.
Hello and welcome to The Intelligence from The Economist. I'm Rosie Blore.
And I'm Jason Palmer. Every weekday, we provide a fresh perspective on the events shaping your world.
You might have noticed that there's about to be an important election. You may also be aware that America really likes to lecture other countries about democracy. So why then did one of our correspondents based overseas find it so hard to vote?
And there are some really obscure things in the Life in the UK test, a step to citizenship. So obscure that when I made my native Brit friends take it, they overwhelmingly failed. We look at what the test reveals about the country's ideals.
But first, Russia's war with Ukraine appears to be widening.
The deployment of North Korean troops to Kursk is also a sign of Putin's growing desperation.
Yesterday, NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte was the latest Western official to confirm the involvement of troops from North Korea.
Over 600,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded in Putin's war. And he is unable to sustain his assault on Ukraine without foreign support.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says that deployment means his country could effectively be forced to fight North Korea in Europe. In public, America's Defense Secretary expresses confidence about how the war is going.
Moscow will never prevail in Ukraine.
But privately, many officials are concerned. And they raise a question. Not can Ukraine win, but can Ukraine even survive?
Things are looking pretty rough for Ukraine on the battlefield right now.
Shashank Joshi is our defense editor.
Its army has hung on to Pokrovsk, which is this key embattled town in the eastern Donbass region, and it might hold on to it to the end of the year. But almost everywhere else you look, from Kupiansk to the north to Chasiv Yar in the east, and also the Kursk front inside Russia, the Russians are doing pretty well and have made more progress in recent months than they have in the past year or so. The problem isn't so much the extent of territory they've taken. It's really the attrition they've inflicted on the Ukrainian force in the process of doing so.
Shashank, before we get on to the Ukrainian side, the news right now seems to be all about the fact that North Korean troops are being deployed by Russia. How important is that? And what does it say about Russia's situation in this war?
North Korean involvement makes a bad situation worse. These aren't huge numbers of troops. We're looking by Ukrainian and South Korean estimates at perhaps 12,000 or so. That's really nothing given the casualties the Russians are burning through, the size of the Russian force. These North Korean troops are probably going to be fighting inside Russia, in Kursk province, which Ukraine invaded back in August. But really, the story here isn't North Korea. It's the fact that Russian attacks in the east, right along the front, have been meeting with a little bit more success than in the past. So it's the Russian advance. But Rosie, the really important thing here is not the territory. It's not actually all that much territory Russia's taking. It's the cost to Ukraine of slowing the Russians down. The worry here is that on current trends, Ukraine just isn't going to be able to do this for as long as the Russians are.
Let me just push you a little bit more on the Russian situation. It does still seem to be a sign of weakness that Russia should need troops from another country. I mean, is there some bigger picture here that I'm missing about Russia's greater weakness?
Russia is stretched. It's suffered probably 600,000 dead and wounded since the beginning of the war, if you take American estimates. The Ukrainians tell us that Russians have lost about 57,000 dead in the year to October. These are staggering losses, and North Korean troops help balance out the front. But I'm wary of saying this is a crisis for Russia. And the reason I'm wary of saying it is because the Russians, thanks to basically big payments, are still recruiting around 30,000 men a month. That was the figure given to me by a senior NATO official about a week ago. And it's not enough to overwhelm the Ukrainians with a massive army, but it's enough to cover their losses. And that's what really matters. I think you could look at the same picture, Rosie, on weapons. Is it a sign of weakness that Russia is relying on millions of shells from North Korea? Or actually, is it just a way of compounding their 2-to-1 firepower advantage over Ukraine? If you're Ukrainian facing 2 times as many shells coming at you as go the other way, it's not all that much consolation to think, well, at least we're not relying on those terrible North Koreans.
Turning that question around slightly, is it a surprise then that Russia is still so strong, particularly given sanctions?
I spoke to one intelligence official some days ago who said, we think Russia is doping their economy. And of course, you see this in the figures. Inflation is probably twice the official rate, according to all the experts. Russia's spending 30 to 40% of its government spending on the military. And this is starving the civilian economy. This is having huge knock-on effects. It's inevitable at some point that the economic chickens will come home to roost. But they can sustain it. They can keep it going. And that's the problem, that Russia's woes are slow burning. They'll manifest at some point, but it could be the second half of next year. Ukraine's problems are much more immediate. I think they're going to be felt in the next 6 months. And that discrepancy, that difference, is where a lot of the problems of this war come in.
Tell me the problems that Ukraine will then face in the next 6 months.
If we just look at the battlefield today to get a sense of where these problems are coming from, what's happening is that they are running out of tactical air defense interceptors. So Russian reconnaissance drones can basically flood the battlefield without fear of being shot down. They can spot targets for ballistic missiles and drones to hit artillery in the rear. They can direct glide bombs against troops at the front lines. And so Russia's able to make slow but steady advances. And the Ukrainians, in trying to stop that, are facing really serious casualties. They are not able to mobilize enough young men to replenish those casualties because people are unwilling to sign up. They're unwilling to sign up because they're concerned about a lack of training. They're concerned that these are indefinite tours of duty. And so what we see in Ukraine today, perhaps its single biggest problem, is a mobilization crisis. And as that crisis plays out, at some stage, that could be the winter, that could be the spring, that could be later, the fear is Ukraine just won't have enough men on the front lines to stem this Russian tide, and that Russian advances at that point will then accelerate.
And does Ukraine have any tools at its disposal to deal with that crisis?
The West can't give Ukraine young men. It can do a lot of other stuff. It can deliver shells. It can deliver rockets and missiles. It can ease permissions on where Ukraine can fire those missiles. It can help with intelligence, as it has been doing to take out the Russian Black Sea Fleet. It can tighten sanctions. It can do all of those things. And indeed, I'm seeing some evidence that the Biden administration, as we get very close to an election, as they begin thinking about the prospect of a Trump presidency that might cut off aid to Ukraine, they are making real efforts to accelerate aid flows to Ukraine. We just had a big announcement of, I think, $800 million worth of support for Ukraine's long-range drone strikes. And those drone strikes are doing a great job taking out arms depots, command posts, pretty far behind the front lines. But at the end of the day, when I talk to people in the Pentagon, I sense quite a lot of frustration. And some of that is directed at the Ukrainians. They think that the Ukrainians haven't done enough to fix their mobilization and training pipeline. Now, of course, if you talk to Ukrainians, they are frustrated by the fact that the West hasn't given them the arms that it said it would. The European Union promised 1 million shells for Ukraine, for instance. It's nowhere close to that, as far as I understand. So there are recriminations flying on all sides, but clearly, wherever you look, the mood is glummer than it was even just a few months ago.
And as you say, a few months ago, we were also pretty glum. So where do you see it going from here and how soon?
I think it's not an immediate crisis. That is, I'm not suggesting we're going to see the Russians suddenly break through, stream towards Ukrainian cities like Dnipro or Odessa that have been relative sanctuaries so far. The Russians, as I said, have a lot of weaknesses, and one of those is that they can't mass their forces, they can't exploit breakthroughs and move rapidly, fluidly down through Ukrainian territory. There's still a lot of problems on their side. But what I will say is that nobody today is talking about serious Ukrainian counteroffensives as we were at the beginning of 2023. No one thinks that that's a serious Ukrainian option in the short or medium term. And I think when I talk to American officials, the language that they use in their planning is, how does Ukraine survive? It's not, how do we deliver this fantastic punch at the Russians, force them to the table? It's, how do we keep them on the battlefield for the next few years, and how do we put them in a strong enough position that if there are negotiations, if there are talks, that the Ukrainians won't be doing that from a position of abject weakness.
Sobering stuff, Shashank. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you so much.
In the United States, access to voting has become incredibly important for two different reasons.
Tom Easton is our Mumbai bureau chief.
It's become incredibly important because it may determine who wins the election, and it's become incredibly important on a kind of theoretical and philosophical level for defining what is American democracy and the right of everyone in the United States to have a vote. This is true for people in the most remote part of the United States, but it's also true for people all around the world.
Today, on the anniversary of Bloody Sunday, I'm signing an executive order to make it easier for eligible voters to register to vote and improve access to voting.
So in 2021, Joe Biden signed an executive order, and it begins with the following line: "The right to vote is the foundation of American democracy." And it commands the American federal establishment to assist in having people vote.
Every eligible voter should be able to vote and have that vote counted.
This has been perceived in some ways to be controversial because in America, the architecture of voting in federal election is designed by the states, not by the federal government. And many people perceive this sort of federal intervention into the voting process to be actually an effort by the party in control to get groups that they think would vote favorably for them in greater mass coming to the polls.
If you care even one whit about election integrity, striking down every prohibition on ballot harvesting is precisely the wrong step to take.
But there's also a kind of larger reason where it seems intuitively nice. I mean, you want the federal government to help people to vote. In a democracy, you want access to the polls to be enjoyed by everyone, because that means both the most powerful and the least powerful people in a society have the right to participate in control. And in America, that includes people not only in the most remote hamlet, it also includes people all around the world. And included in those people, at least in theory, is me, who could not really be further away from America than I am right now, voting in Mumbai. So India is a very difficult place. It's hard sometimes to get your mail received. It's hard to get from one place to another. That doesn't stop anyone from doing it, but it does take a tremendous amount of effort. So I went to try to find all the information that one could get on voting. And one of the things that was established is that you should sign up online and you should get a ballot in the mail. And no ballot arrived in the mail for me. And in fact, I know at least one other person who tried to get a ballot through the mail, and it didn't arrive for them. As per the online instructions, the only alternative was to print out the ballot myself. But that proved a confusing process, to say the least. PDFs that were supposed to be included were mislabeled, and the instructions for posting and packaging contravened the instructions for mail-in ballots within the United States. It was all confusing, and no one picked up at the consulate on the number that was listed on the website for voting questions. So I, like any overseas American, headed off for the local representative office of my government. Now, the consulate is located in the new business district, and it's a traffic-clogged area, and it takes hours to get there. Once you arrive at the consulate, there are some directions on where to go, and you pass a guy who has a machine gun, and you go through this little parking area, and outside the main consulate office is a box with a cheap padlock and a glass window with a little bulletproof hole. And I said I needed to speak to someone with help on voting, and they called upstairs to whatever poor guy was stuck dealing with my request, and clearly he didn't want to go downstairs to help me. But after much discussion and asserting myself as an American citizen, he did make it to the other side of the bulletproof window while I was poaching in the heat outside, and was of no help. He clearly had not read Joe Biden's executive action of 2021. The man couldn't give a clear answer on how to package the ballot. He advised using glue and gobs of tape to bundle up the forms, but other instructions advised against this. He said that's just what people do, and in any case, he said he could not even provide what he recommended, and instead said I must find it elsewhere, which in reality meant hours-long slogs through traffic to find what was needed, but might still never work. Before I left, the one question that I had for him is this how you vote? Because, you know, in America, it's very important that nobody have priority over anyone else. It's very clear in the Constitution that the government works for the people and not the other way around. When I asked this man the question how he votes, he said, I vote by diplomatic pouch. And I said, well, can I do what you do? And he also said, no. And that was the end of our discussion at the consulate. So I went away. I came back the next day. I pasted everything together. I got past the guy with the gun. I went to the ballot box and I put my ballot into that box. I went to take a picture of the white envelope going in the box, and security at the embassy called for backup assistance to come and presumably throw me off of the property. And getting the message, I left. I had no assurance whether it would reach anything. And by the way, given the limited information I have been given on how to track a ballot, this was several weeks ago, it has not been received and it has not gotten anywhere. Given the challenges of voting, it's something that's very, very easy not to do. Any single person's vote is not going to be meaningful in a country where hundreds of millions of people vote. But it's also essential for democracy, if it is to function, that each person put aside that logical equation and decide that their vote does matter, and it should be considered, and it should be registered. And they have to do that to make whatever opinion they have be heard. This becomes all the more important when you're overseas, because America is always lecturing countries all over the world about the importance of democracy and importance of voting. It even sends politicians and ex-politicians to monitor votes around the world. That was one of Jimmy Carter's hobbies after he was president.
So when Noriega candidates began to announce the results, I knew that they were false. So in my bumbling Spanish, I stood up on a table and I denounced the election as fraudulent.
I think many people think that America's lecturing of people around the world on democracy is utterly hollow. What is also true that in a country like India, they take voting very, very seriously. So when the votes come, people stain their finger with a very special purple ink, and then they take pictures of their finger to post on all sorts of social media, suggesting that they had voted in an election. I mean, it becomes a statement of commitment in the fundamental principles and openness of their country. And there's tremendous pride that is attached to that staining of the purple ink. Many people in India would think that America's advocacy is really a very cynical advocacy. It's the kind of thing that we tell other people to do without taking it seriously ourselves. So even though this event in some ways was absolutely meaningless in terms of what it could accomplish or what it does, symbolically, it reflected many important things, both about America and America in the world. And it would be taken very seriously by many people in America and many people around the world.
And if you're quick, you can get 2 years of The Economist half price, including full access to Economist Podcast Plus. The offer ends on Thursday. Subscribing helps make our journalism possible. Thank you.
Okay, Rosie, important question. Who did William III fight at the Battle of Boyne in 1690? Was it Charles II, Elizabeth I, Henry V, or James II?
Oh my lord. 1690. Can't believe you're doing this to me. Charles II or Henry V, right?
Rory, which date each year is St Andrew's Day? The 30th of January, February, November, or December?
February.
So Dan, how long can you use a driver's licence from another country in the UK after you arrive? 2 months, 6 months, 12 months, or 24 months?
I don't know, like 6 months?
Listen to some of these practice questions from the Life in the UK test, a quiz for foreigners seeking citizenship. It's a 24-question test, multiple choice, to be taken in 45 minutes. To pass, you have to get 3/4 of them right. It's clear that my colleagues haven't had the joy that I have of studying the guidebook or the practice test app. It is an eclectic course of study.
The British citizenship test is a strange beast. It combines questions on law and local government with really quite a lot of questions on British history and what Britons like to do, or what the British citizenship test thinks that Britons like to do.
Catherine Nixie is a Britain correspondent for The Economist.
According to the British citizenship test, your average Briton likes to eat Sunday roasts, loves a bit of Welsh cake, and they like to celebrate Diwali in Leicester. They also like to send Valentine's letters anonymously, slightly creepily. They like to watch the boat race, say things such as, he bowled a googly, and they like nothing better than on April Fool's Day to play tricks on each other until midday. I mean, basically, they sound incredibly annoying. And if that doesn't actually sound like any Briton that you know or have ever met, there is one very British thing about it, namely irony, because almost any native-born Briton would fail this test of Britishness.
See, I remember taking this test and having, in fact, the practice test app on my phone. And after I passed, I hung on to it for the longest time, giving this test to all of my British friends. And you know what? Overwhelmingly, they flunked it.
Badly, or like by a whisker?
It was a mix of things. The pass rate is something like 71%. I think maybe 3/4, 4/5 of the people that I gave it to did not pass. What are the actual numbers, though? How many people take this test for real?
So what you experienced was pretty much exactly how it plays out across Britain. So it's been sat around 2 million times since it was introduced in 2005. And it's quite expensive. It's 50 quid a go. And to pass, you've got to get 75%, but around 1/4 of people fail it.
So I guess my question is, why have this kind of test at all? Is there no other way to do it?
There are plenty of other ways to do it. And over the millennia, they've been tried. In the British Empire, wherever you came from in the empire, you were allowed to settle in Britain. And in the 1948 British Nationality Act, they actually enshrined that in law. But since then, people have gone off citizenship and the mass awarding of it in quite a big way. Citizenship tests, so trying to make it harder for people to get in rather than easier, first arose in America in 1887. And that test was basically a language test. And it's thought it was aimed more or less at keeping out illiterate Southern and Eastern Europeans from America. And since the 1990s, they've really spread much more rapidly. Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Britain, they've all introduced them since then. And most countries call them integration tests, but people are sceptical. They say, nonsense, they're actually barriers to integration rather than bridges to it.
So it's enough to make you ask about what the point of this is. I mean, what's your take on the notion that it's not an integration test, but rather another barrier to integration?
I don't know. It's a really interesting question, actually. I talked to the historian Dan Jones, who said it does help you understand Britain. And he said if you don't have any history at all, that kind of panders to this prissy metropolitan distaste for anything that seems remotely patriotic. And he also said, probably more importantly for people who are going to live here, that if you did have all of this knowledge, then you'd do really well in your local pub quiz. And few things are more British than that.
Catherine, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for this episode of The Intelligence. Do let us know what you think of the show. You can get in touch at podcasts@economist.com. We'll see you back here tomorrow.